So we saw earlier that Father Panelu preached a sermon at the beginning of the start of the plague, and the tone of the sermon was harsh, and but the message was subtle, right? And it's important to know he wasn't. Yeah, he begins the sermon by saying, "Calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and you deserved it." But it's not that he's wishing evil on them, or he wasn't saying that God caused the plague, but rather that the people were reaping what they sowed. Now, in this sermon, there's a shift in Father Panelu himself. So this is for the second sermon, and the tone of this sermon is very different. So in the meantime, Father Panelu has had quite a bit of experience that's notable. We seen that Father Panelu, he joined the sanitation squads. Right? So that meant he he decided to be part of the solution, right? And he went out there, put his life on the line to help, okay, the city and help the people. Then we also saw him around the bedside with the um, so the boy who died. Okay, sorry to say the boy's death, and we saw that he was the only one who actually stared into the boy as the boy was doing his death scream, right? And he cried out to God and he prayed to God, "My God, spare this child." But his prayer was drowned out by the sound of all the suffering and the cries. So he's had a lot of experience in the meantime, right? So his sermon does reflect that. Now he's had a slightly different perspective. Now, so what on page 220, you can see it says that that he um, had rubbed shoulders with death. Okay, so I mean, so it's very different. So if you recall when Jean Taru and Dr. Ryu was speaking about Father Panelu's sermon, uh, Dr. Ryu's point was only someone who hasn't had this personal experience with death would preach a sermon like that. Right? So it wasn't a question of faith or reason. It was just simply that that's a man who hasn't really had this personal encounter with death. Now, when you've had that kind of encounter with death, then you're just quite not as sure about things as you thought you were. Okay, and your message is going to be different. That was according to Dr. Ryu. So anyway, you have this sermon. It's the congregation was pretty sparse, relatively speaking. The church was only three-quarters full. So of course, people had died, or people had gotten more superstitious. So they were abandoning religion for superstition. All right. So a few things to note is that the tone was gentler this time. Um, he stumbles over his words. Okay, and this idea of stumbling over words is important. So if you think of someone in this book who stumbles over his words, Joseph Grand. Um, if he's right. For instance, Grand is writing this book, and he's trying to find the perfect word to express himself, and he can't. Right? The words just he come up with a passage and basically rip it up and start all over. And Grand is also someone who has had a problem expressing himself, right? And so one example is that he got an offer, or in his job, decades ago, his boss had offered him a promotion, but then his boss gets replaced, and all he has to do is simply tell the new boss, right? And this broach the subject, but he doesn't because he doesn't want to, because of this idea with words, right? And he just never does it. And then same thing with his wife is they have a long marriage, but they stop paying attention to the relationship, and the marriage dissolves. And he says, "I loved her, I just never found the words to say it." So he has a problem with words, but the interesting thing is Jean Taru felt that Joseph Grand was the most authentic of all of them. And this idea of stumbling over words in this context, in this book, is a good thing, right? Because in some way, it signifies someone who's less sure about things and who accepts to some degree that their words are incapable of expressing reality as it is, right? So there's something elusive about reality. Okay, so we see this observation here that Father Panulu stumbles over his words. And that's some to reflect it, something good that he's unsure of himself now. He has experienced death, um, and things aren't quite as clear as they need to be. Right? He's seen life as a little vague, absurd, and that's a good thing. Now, he no longer says. So we're back to Father Panulu. So no yous, right? It's all we. Okay, so he is now including himself, so that's kind of a step in the direction of humility. Now he said, now that we've experienced the plague, we're better able to comprehend its message, right? So if you think about what's going on here, is that at the start of the plague, right, he felt he understood the plague, and so he was able to give this scathing sermon based on his theoretical understanding of the plague. But now he's actually experienced it. He's now experienced the plague, and now he feels he's in a better place to actually speak about the plague. Okay, and so that's one difference between two sermons is that one was based in theory, and one is now based on experience. So he felt that his first sermon still held, right? But and so he believed he wasn't wrong then. He just felt he lacked charity. He lacked love, right? And he should have spoken better in a way that was more charitable. Now he does. There's a quote on page 23 that I think is a good thing. He says, and indeed, so this is on Father Panulu's sermon. And indeed, what a Christian should always seek in this hour of trial was to discern that good, and this on page 223, in what it consisted and how best he could turn it to account. Okay, so what's going on with that quote on page 223? The whole idea, if you remember, with the first sermon, the implication was that there was good that comes from evil. So that sort of made evil fine, right? He sort of in some way justified evil, saying, well, good things come from evil, so it's okay, right? The sorts of good things that you may otherwise not have gotten, right? So in some way, there's some sort of good to come out of evil. We'll see a slight change in that view here. But what he is saying here um, is that when you go through suffering, right? So this is there's a change, is that you can look for ways. So when you go through suffering, look for ways, okay, to turn suffering to good. Okay, so that's slightly different, right? It's one thing to say um, after night comes a day, right? Because then you're saying you need to go through night and darkness to come out to come out on the other side, which is dawn and daylight. So that might say that evil is necessary for some sort of good to follow. In this case, he's not saying that. He's saying now when you experience evil, right, is he doesn't want to justify evil, but he says, well, what you can do is try to look for ways to turn this suffering to good, right? You discern and see what you can get out of this, right? So the difference here is that in the first sermon, so sermon one, he seemed to justify evil, okay? And then here, he's saying he's no longer justifying evil. He's no longer saying, "Oh, it's good. It's of this darkness that has to come first, and then you get light." Rather, he's saying, "Look to see if you can get something good out of this." Okay. Now, so the idea is don't look to explain the plague. Just look to see what good can um, come out of come out of it. Now, also on page 223, he says, we might try to explain the phenomenon of the plague, but above all, we should learn what it has to teach us. Okay? Ryu gathered that, and so this Ryu thinking, to the father's thinking, there was really nothing to explain. All right, so in the face of evil, suffering, okay, um, don't attempt to explain evil. Right, so we can see we saw this in the previous video with the death of the boy, which is that um, when you come up against evil and suffering, it is senseless in itself, right? So the response to it is either the faith response, which is to cry out and it gets drowned out by suffering, or the reason response is like Dr. Ryu, which is just to be exhausted by evil because there's just really nothing. It's just exhausting. It's just like hidden up against the wall that just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so you don't try to explain evil. Okay, just accept it as evil or suffering, right? This sort of senseless suffering. So Ryu goes on to there's some things that we can grasp concerning God and some things that we can't, right? He says there's a difference between good and evil. Okay, so there's no question that there's a difference between good and evil, and but evil is the issue, and for evil includes human suffering. Okay, and so he says, don't don't try to explain away evil, right? And so, for instance, think about when a child suffers or something really senseless seems to happen, right? Don't try to explain that away, right? He says, just look at evil and take and accept it for what it is. That it is evil, right? Period. All right. So let me read something from, I believe it's page 224. All right. So he says, this is 5 lines from the top. He says, he, Father Panulu, refused to have recourse to the simple devices enabling him to scale that wall. Thus, he might easily have assured them that the child's sufferings would be compensated by an eternity of bliss awaiting him. But how could he give that assurance when, to tell the truth, he knew nothing about it? Okay, so this is important, right? Very often, when we try to address, issues of suffering and evil, we try to compensate for evil by saying, well, um, we we experience X amount of suffering on earth, okay, um, but in heaven we will experience an eternity of bliss. Okay, now, um, all right, so that's one way of looking at this, where you say, on earth we do suffer sometimes senselessly, really horrible things happen, but God will make up for this in heaven. And this is a legitimate way of looking at this. Okay, so the issue here is this question of amount. It depends on how you look at suffering and how you look at the experience of eternity. Okay, but when you think in this terms of amount, so we experience 20 years of suffering on earth, but in heaven it'll be an eternity of bliss. Um, Father Panelu has a problem with that because he says there's really that's in a way sort of explaining away evil. So he says, um, for who would dare to assert that eternal happiness can compensate for a single moment's human suffering? Right. So essentially, he's flipping this around and saying, well, how do you know anything can compensate for suffering? And there is something to this, right? Which is sometimes when something bad happens, it's irreversible. It's happened, right? And it can be really horrible and evil, right? So there's nothing ever that can undo that, right? So his point is, instead of putting, suggesting that the bliss in heaven would outweigh the suffering on earth, is maybe look at the evil in itself and say maybe nothing can, right? There's nothing that can actually compensate for something really bad, something really evil that's happened on this earth. So this is not typical Christian thinking. Okay, so again, we have to recall that this is Albert Camus who is putting the words in Father Panelou's mouth. Okay? Now, but he does say something really profound here. He says, um, "He who asserted that, right, that, and that's the idea that if you suffer, you can suffer a small amount here, but in heaven you will enjoy heaven, and that will make up." Okay, so excuse me, Father Panelu says, "He who asserted that would not be a true Christian, a follower of the Master who knew all the pangs of suffering in his body and his soul." Okay, so he now points to Jesus and on the cross, and here I think there's this in some way dovetails with some aspects of typical Christian approaches to suffering. So all Father Panelu is saying is that, look, I can't make any guarantees about if heaven will make up for the suffering on earth. In fact, I have no reason to be able to say that, right? Because evil is just simply evil. But he can point to one thing in Christianity, which in some way can compensate, which is the fact that Jesus himself suffered and died on the cross. And in Christianity, Jesus' um, event on the cross, his suffering and death on the cross, was such that he took on all the suffering of all people on himself. Okay, and so that is really for Father Panelu the only consolation we have that we know. Anything else we don't know for him, right? For him, it's simply all we can do is just look at the figure of Christ on the cross, right? Jesus, the Son of God, suffered, right? And then we also then can experience that suffering with him and nothing else, right? Don't try to figure out anything else. Okay, so if here I could just add another element here, and in the documents of Vatican II, so this little bit I'm saying here is not Father Panelu, but well, what you do get from the Catholic Church in the documents of Vatican II is this idea of suffering that the question of theodicy, right? So we've talked about theodicy, which is the question of if God is all loving and all powerful, why is there suffering in the world? That question is not, I think I mentioned that the question is not a theological question. It's a philosophical question. It's a valid question, but it's not a theological or faith question. Rather, the faith approach is that you accept the world for what it is. It has evil. But what you do know is that since God sent his son Jesus to die, is that we have solidarity with Christ on the cross, right? So in our suffering, in our pain, we know God understands what we're going through because he had to experience that through Christ on the cross. Okay, so that's the way Vatican II tends to approach this question of evil, is not to explain evil, right? But simply say, look, Christ on the cross, in Christ on the cross, God understands what you're going through. And at that point, just leave everything else to God and trust. Okay? And then Father Panelu will see says something very similar. Okay, now let's just finish up this second sermon. So Father Panelu is calling for this complete faith in God and um, not to try to explain evil. So this is an interesting thing because if, for instance, when bad things happen, when really horrible things happen, you are looking for answers, right? You want to know why. That's the natural response, and we saw that with Dr. Ryu. He wanted to know why, and he was angry. And at this point, Father Panelu is just calling for trust in God, right? So, to some degree, you just have to remember you have to realize you can't explain evil. And so he has this very interesting point that he makes, which is that. So let me see if I can pull this up here on page 227. So he says, there was no question of not taking precautions or failing to comply with the orders wisely promulgated for the public weal in the disorders of pestilence. Nor should we listen to certain moralists who told us to sink on our knees and give up the struggle, right? So that's what I want to focus on, right? He's making this point that we shouldn't, if the Christian approach is not to fall on your knees and just give up and to pray to God and say, oh, God, help, and just basically stop. He says, no, we should go forward, groping our way through the darkness, right? So if you remember, this phrase came up earlier with Dr. Ryu, groping our way. Okay, so groping our way through the darkness, stumbling perhaps at times, and try to do what good lay in our power. As for the rest, we must hold fast, trusting in the divine goodness, even as to the deaths of little children, and not seeking personal respite. Excuse me. All right. So his point is, we need to grope through the darkness. We need to stumble through life, right? I mean, there's all this suffering and evil, and we can't figure it out. But we have to do what's in our power, right? So you pray and you act, okay? But you have to then at some point just understand that you can't explain evil slash suffering, right? So someone will ask you, why did this person have to die? Why did this child have to suffer? Why did this person, this horrible thing happen to that person? You can't explain. There's nothing you can do to explain, right? But what you have to do is just basically stumble your way through life, do what is in your power to do, right? And just simply trust God. Let God hope for the rest. So you can see this is slightly different from what Dr. Ryu said about Father Panaloo, right? Is that Father Panaloo does, at least now, right, is sees the Christian life as one of prayer, but also action, and then finally this obedience and trust, simply understanding your limitations. Okay. Now, so just a couple of things to close out this discussion of Father Panaloo. We see that eventually um, he does get the plague, and he refuses any medical help. Okay, and but he is a changed man. If you recall, we saw him at the beginning. He was described as a um, learned and militant Jesuit. Okay, so he was a priest, a Jesuit. He was learned. He was militant. He preached this very scathing sermon, and then he joins the sanitation squads. Right, he experiences the boy's death, and he becomes a very different kind of person. Okay, so he's had this journey now from when we first encountered him to this point. Now, if you recall, we've said that in this book, the plague is a metaphor, okay, for, so whatever it's a metaphor for, it's, evil, suffering, or whatever it is, okay, um, it's a metaphor for something, right? So it's interesting with Father Panelu that when he gets sick, and Dr. Ryu finally shows up and decides, I'm going to stay with you, and he shows his solidarity with him, right? So the man of reason, the man of science with the man of faith. Then bottom of page 233. His temperature rose throughout the day. The cough grew louder, racking the enfeebled body. At last, at nightfall, Father Panulu brought up the clot of matter that was choking him. It was red. Even at the height of his fever, Panulu's eyes kept a blank serenity. Right, so we can see, in some sense, at least they're hinting at some serenity. He's at peace. Okay, and when the next morning he was found dead, his body drooping over the bedside, they betrayed nothing. Right, his eyes betrayed nothing. No fear, unlike Monsieur Michel, who died screaming at the rats. Right, we can see he dies in a peaceful way. There's something settled about Father Panulu. Right, against his name, the index card recorded doubtful case. Okay, so this is interesting in the context of the book, right? Is that he gets something, and we all think, of course, it's got to be the plague, but the in the end, it's more of a doubtful case. It doesn't seem to fit, right, all the characteristics. But in terms of the broader metaphor, right, again, this is interesting that Father Panulu dies not of the plague, but whatever he dies of, it's a doubtful case, right? So, whatever it is that plagues all humankind in terms of this metaphor, it doesn't plague Father Panulu. And I like to think in some cases because he grew right from um, this of self-absorption and abstraction to um, more authenticity, right? So he does go on this journey from abstraction. That's where things are not necessarily real to him. Okay, he's theoretical. You can think of it that way. Okay, to authenticity. Okay, so his case is a doubtful case, and this is even different from Jean Taru, who is we'll see in his case what happens to him. Okay, so that's Father Panalu's second sermon and a few comments about Father Panalu's journey.